Hi, my name is Dr. Laura Beadling. I teach English here at YSU, and as part of that, sometimes I get to teach a class specifically on graphic novels. So I was very excited to see Hey Kiddo on this year's English Festival list. I think Hey Kiddo is particularly relevant at this time, as a lot of us find ourselves turning to arts of various sort to cope with quarantine and our anxieties about COVID-19. And so he does a lot of stuff in this memoir. He talks about being raised by his grandparents because his mom was an addict. He discusses how he was able to connect with his father and step-siblings a little bit later in his life. And most importantly, to me at least, he shows how he developed as an artist and what roles art played for him at various points in his life. So it's this last point that I want to spend some time looking at today. If you can, please get out your copy of Hey Kiddo, because I'm going to point us to some specific pages and images. So yeah, one of the things that I personally like to do when I get a new graphic novel is I like to look at the opening images. So before the writer or artist gets to the narrative, the characters and what they're doing and what's going on with them, I like to look at those very opening images. So that can include, first of all, the cover art, which I love on Hey Kiddo, right? It's a very interesting set of colors. I love the font. And I also like the fairly big shadow that's included that the figure is throwing on the wall behind him. And I think you can think about that shadow in a lot of different ways as to what that represents. If you just open the cover, the first page, you get another glossy page with a much younger figure, but throwing an even bigger shadow on the wall behind him. In this case, the figure is looking out and kind of breaking the fourth wall by staring back at us, the reader. And so it's a much more sort of confrontational gaze, which I think also is really interesting to think about in the context of this story and character. If you keep turning pages, the next one is you get this sort of outdoor setting page that has a bridge and a street light in the sky there. Yeah, and it's a road scene. You get an empty road there going underneath the bridge. If you turn one more page to the title page, you get sort of a spread here of a two-page scene with some advertising images, some storefronts, and again, it's a road scene, so you get several cars. And then one more page, and you get another two-page spread here of cars, and you can see in particular inside this car to see an older figure and a younger figure driving together. And so I just like to look and see what the artist included before the story proper ever gets going. And in this case, I think one of the things that Krosoczka was doing was sort of telling us where the story takes place. Once the story gets going, a lot of it takes place inside interior spaces, like houses or bedrooms or classrooms. There's not necessarily a whole ton of exterior work. And so these opening images really set us up for the town, the place, the physical setting where this story is taking place, which I think is really kind of interesting. And then right before the story gets going, the last wordless image we see there in the opening pages is of Jarrett and his grandfather in a car. And I think that's just such a really interesting way to start. And I think it's worth sort of thinking, if you were going to write a graphic memoir about your childhood and your family, how would you represent that place? And what would that place be? Would it be your house or your neighborhood? Would it be your town? And how would you represent that? And then if you had to sort of pick one image to kind of represent something that was a major part of your childhood, if it was just you and one other person in a place doing a thing, what would those be? Who would you be with? Where would you be? And what would you be doing to really represent something important or something meaningful to you about your childhood? And that's a lot harder to do than it might at first think, but I think it's definitely worth thinking about. The second thing that I noticed about this is how important the pocket squares and the pineapple wallpaper are. And so Jarrett talks a little bit about the limited color palette that he chose to work with in this. in the back of the book. So if you flip past all of the story and you get to a section in prose at the end, actually a couple sections, you get an author's note about his relationship with his mom, and then you also get, if you go past that, a note on the art. And in this he talks about how he decided what color he wanted to use in this very limited color palette graphic memoir. And so he talked about his grandfather loving pocket squares, which are just a little square of fabric out of a suit that come out of a suit pocket. And as his grandfather says, it can add a splash of color to a suit. And so when his grandfather died, Jarrett said he couldn't bring himself to throw all those pocket squares away, so he kept some. And one of the ones that he kept was this particular burnt orange, that even if you just flip through the book, you see that burnt orange color on page after page after page. So it's very monotone artistically, but with that particular color foregrounded. And then he also notes in that same place in the book that his grandmother just loved pineapples and actually had some pineapple wallpaper that she loved. And once she died and they were cleaning out their house, he found a spare roll of that pineapple wallpaper that he kept. So he had that very material on hand, and he said he sort of collaged it and worked it in a number of places in the book. So I've got a couple there in particular for you to look at. On page 160, you see a scene taking place in the kitchen, and if you look closely at the background, it's both burnt orange and it also has that pineapple wallpaper design. Likewise, 178 and 179, if you flip to those pages, that's sort of an interstitial moment, sort of between chapters. So we get some mementos from his childhood, and then also the next sort of chapter page starts with the pineapple wallpaper design behind the words. And yeah, so I thought that was also a really interesting thing to think about, and to cast your mind back onto those important spaces where you spent a lot of time as a childhood. And what are the colors that you associate with that time in your life? Or are there any designs or images or artworks that you remember that were important in that place? And yeah, I thought that's a really interesting thing that he was able to work in almost every page or every chapter of the book. And so again, to distill so much important stuff from your childhood into these very meaningful choices is really interesting. Lastly, again, I think one of the most important things in this is Jarrett's development as an artist. So he uses his art to connect to his mother before he is even really able to express himself fully in words. The letters that he and she send back and forth are often done in artwork. So she'll send him a drawing of a character and request that he draw some other character and send it back to her. So it's his art in some ways represents his connection with his mother that goes even before he developed the ability to fully use language and words. He also includes throughout the whole memoir images of him drawing at various ages, regardless of whether or not the art is any good, right? How many of us really make any art that is particularly worthy when we're young? But he shows throughout a lot of images of him drawing. So if you look at page 71 to 73, he actually shows us the character of young Jarrett drawing, and then we flip the page and get a whole section, a whole page that shows what he was working on. And it's a 2-page spread. Again, it's a huge thing, and the art is not good, right? This looks very much like children's art, because that's what it is. And yet, even though it's not very good, this is an important moment in his life, and he spends a lot of his images showing us the role of art in his life. And that's throughout this whole book. You can see it over and over again. He also talks about the different roles and purposes that art has played in his life at various times. So if you look ahead to page 214 and 215 and 16, he kind of explicitly says what he used in various times for. So he talks about when he was a kid, he drew to get attention from his family. In junior high, he drew to impress his friends. But then the final moment there in that sequence, he says, "But now that I am in my teens, I fill sketchbooks just to deal with life. to survive. And I thought that was really interesting as well. So part of dealing with life, part of surviving life, is using his art to express his emotions and deal with his fears. And one of the sequences that I just love that does that really well is early in the book when he's still very young. He describes some recurring nightmares that he has about monsters creeping up on him. And there's, again, a 2-page spread that shows these monsters. And so he literally depicts his dreams. And it's very dark and very disturbing. But it helps him process those fears that are being reflected in his dreams. So whatever kind of art you were interested in, either making or experiencing, because there's really a range, right? Whether that's writing or music or drawing or acting or dancing or any other artistic outlet you can think of, I think it's worthwhile to think about how might you depict those dreams that you've had. We all have certain dreams that stick with us for one reason or another. And often I think they stick with us because there's something particularly visceral or important about those. If you were to write about those, or if you were to draw about some of the dreams that you remember, how would you express those? I think that's a way to really think about the primary emotions and memories that you have. You can also think about how your art making or art consumption have developed over the course of your life. How have your tastes developed or changed, and who was responsible for sort of introducing you to various artworks. I also think it's interesting to ask an older relative what they remember you making as a child, because we all make art of various sorts before we know that making art is a thing, right? We all dance, we all sing, we all make stories up, we all draw. What do those older relatives remember of you as a childhood artist? What were your particular interests or subjects? And then finally, what are the connections that you have with other people based on art? Whether it's people that you have a connection to because you both like the same bands or the same kind of music, or because you watch movies together, or because you're both into art and drawing, whatever. What are some of those important life connections you've made with other people that are rooted in some sort of art? In addition, and sort of finally, if you're interested in Hey Kiddo and Jarrett Krosoczka, he has a number of things on YouTube that I think are worth looking into. So he has a TED Talk that talks about his process of becoming an artist. And then he also has a really cool series of art lessons that he's taken videos of. And those are all available on YouTube. So if you just go to YouTube and search on his full name, you should find a lot of things that he created that are, I think, really worth watching. Thanks for your time. I hope this was worthwhile, and enjoy the rest of your festival.